Good day, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 11, which is going to be looking at Ireland, Ulster, and Home Rule. To give people a bit of a chance to join the stream, as always, I'm going to start us off with a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new gods sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made vain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love that heed and folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall wail gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years.
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. Do please go and check out his YouTube channel. He's got some really great music on there. Welcome this evening to my guests, Aaron Hook and Mitch. And our historical subject for this evening is Ireland, Ulster, and Home Rule. And I can tell you frankly, gents, this is not something I'm a huge expert in, but Aaron and Mitch know a lot more about it than I do, so I'm going to hand it over in the first instance to Aaron. Aaron, mate, carry on.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me on. What I'll do is I'll give it sort of whistle-stop tour of sort of Anglo-Irish history from the Middle Ages up into the 1880s. I'll make it as quick as possible. So Anglo-Irish relations really begin in the 12th century, when in the 1160s the King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough, gets deposed. He comes to England and he recruits mercenaries, most notably, most notably the second Earl of Pembroke, Richard de Clare, who also marries his daughter. They go back to Leinster, beat the people who opposed MacMurrough, and then MacMurrough dies. And because he was married to MacMurrough's daughter, Strongbow claims to be king. He gets the support of Henry II because a decade earlier, the Pope had put out a thing called the Lauda Bilita. The Pope in question was Adrian IV, the only English Pope so far. And over the course of the next decade or so, the English effectively conquer Leinster and establish themselves as the lordship of Ireland. So from about 1200 up until the 1530s, things are roughly static. Though the entire island is technically under the lordship of the English king, only the Pale of Dublin, which roughly fits over modern-day County Dublin, was really under English control. Everywhere else was under control of English-descended aristocrats or Anglicised, also medieval Anglicised Gaelic aristocracy, and they become known as the Old English. Now, by the 1530s, things start changing. There's the Break of Rome with Henry VIII, and Ireland ceases to be the lordship of Ireland and becomes the Kingdom of Ireland. From the 1530s up until roughly the 1640s, there are the New English arrive. These are Protestant settlers from England, and then after the union with Scotland, particularly in Ulster, there are Scots, and they establish themselves in Ireland properly. And this angers both the native Irish and the Old English, who have effectively gone native. And this is exacerbated by the fact that the New English are very, very into Protestants, and the Old English and the Gaelic Irish are obviously Catholic and Low Fisherfield. Right, this is when the period of the plantation of Ulster takes place. This all culminates in the 1640 Irish Rebellion, where the Irish rise up and they fight against the English quite successfully, and particularly Northern Ireland, in what's the plantation of Ulster, there are huge massacres where the Irish rebels accept the surrender of English and Scottish settlers, and when they come out of where they are defending, the Irish then massacre them. This sort of builds up a huge sort of outrage in England, and from this confederation, wars take place in Ireland, which is a multi-part civil war connected to the English Civil War. That then comes to an end in 1649 when Cromwell comes over and reconquers Ireland. You have various actions going on there, which are very notorious. Drogheda, though I might point out that most of the soldiers who died at Drogheda, who were defending it, were English royalists. They weren't Irish. And from roughly the early 1560s up until roughly the 1730s, what is called the Protestant ascendancy take power in Ireland. They are a mixture of the New English, the Cromwellian settlers, and then the settlers from Scotland. More of those come over in the late 17th century, and then when you have the Williamite conquest of Ireland, in which takes place the famous Battle of Boyne, which is remembered still to this day by the Irish Order as a great victory. More settlers come over and they establish themselves as this Protestant ascendancy. They are the power. The Old English and the Gaelic Irish aristocracy and land magnates may overwhelmingly lose their property and are replaced by this ascendancy. So by the rough 1730s, the ascendancy are firmly in place. And during the 18th century, Dublin is the second city of the British Empire. Ireland is prospering. It is developing a strong political culture. With the establishment of the ascendancy, they want a bit of political independence. Now, when I say political independence, they want legislative independence, for the Irish Parliament, which has been in existence since 1292. From the sort of 1760s through to the 1780s, a sort of rough movement which becomes known as the Irish Patriot Party forms. They establish the Irish Volunteers, who are there to defend Ireland during the 1770s when there's a threat of a French invasion. But this also becomes roughly a sort of political tool against London, because of course this is taking place during the time of the American Revolution, and there is a fear in London that maybe the Irish Patriots will follow the route of the American rebels. However, this is not what they want, particularly led by Henry Grattan. And Grattan and the Irish Patriots are successful in gaining legislative independence for the Irish Parliament. And so which it roughly took place in about 1784-5. Things are going swimmingly, and then the French Revolution hits. And as with all things, French Revolution fucks everything up, because in London you had the Pitt the Younger government. Pitt the Younger is a reformer, and he's interested in all sorts of things. He's very much willing to give the Irish ascendancy their legislative independence in terms of Parliament, in terms of trade. He's interested in parliamentary reform at home. And then when the French Revolution takes place, all the radicals start supporting it, and he has to become very hardline against any sort of reform. And in Ireland, you have the development, particularly among Protestant in Northern Ireland, particularly among Presbyterians, the formation coming out of the Patriot Party of the Society of the United Irishmen. Notable among these is Wolfe Tone. They are very much imbued with the fervent attitudes of the French Revolution, and they are calling for further reforms, and they're getting more and more radical. And then in 1798, they have connections with France, and then the United Irishmen revolt breaks out. This is a very bloody fight. It devolves into a sectarian fight, because the Irish Catholics tend to support the United Irishmen, whilst the overwhelmingly Anglican ascendancy and working class Anglicans, and eventually working class Protestants from other denominations, support the British administration. And at the end of this, once it is suppressed, the British government decide the Irish can't be trusted with legislative independence, and they decide to abolish Parliament and carry out an act of union with Great Britain to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And then from 1801, when the Act comes into force, up until roughly the 1820s, things are roughly quiet in Ireland. However, then in the 1820s, when Britain is entering an era of reform, I should say at this point that the Ireland now has MPs at Westminster, and one of these MPs is a young sort of Irish solicitor, barrister and reformer called Daniel O'Connell. He is very much in favour. His sort of political career is defined by two issues. One, he wants Catholic emancipation, because during the Cromwellian and Williamite era, there are strong anti-Catholic laws in the books in Ireland, and also to a lesser degree at this point in England. And also he wants the repeal of the Act of Union. Now, O'Connell is very clear that he wants legislative independence for Ireland, but he doesn't want independence from Britain. He wants the Crown to remain, and he wants it to remain as a part of the British Empire. O'Connell is unsuccessful in this, and he dies in the 1840s, just as the famine is about to hit. Now, Ireland, up until the 1840s, is roughly still in this sort of reasonable prosperous period that it was in the 18th century. Then the potato famine hits in the mid-1840s. Now, the potato famine doesn't, despite what Irish Americans like to claim, purely hit Ireland. It hits all of Europe, and is one of the causes that leads to the revolutions of 1848. In Ireland, it particularly hits them bad because the Irish poor are very much dependent on the potato. And actually, that's quite correct. O'Connell did get on with the Conservatives, and in fact, Conservatives had a significant presence in Ireland at this point, and would throughout the 19th century. And now, when the famine hits, the government of the day is Sir Robert Peel, and he's a Conservative, he is the Conservative Party. In fact, I should say, it is now, at this point, the Conservative Party is called the Conservatives. They were the Tories from roughly the 1790s up until 1832, and in the aftermath of that, they change, and with the Tamworth Manifesto, which Peel writes, they become the Conservative Party in 1834. Now, Peel's reaction to the famine is to establish public works. He sent aid over there, and these things really do alleviate the trouble. And Ireland is actually doing reasonably well under Peel. However, Peel at the same time is repealing the Corn Laws. A lot of the sort of backbench Tories are not happy about this because they are landowners, and the Corn Laws, for those who don't know, was a protective measure to protect British corn growers from importation of foreign corn. And Peel wants this because he's very much in favour of free trade, and also you can see it will also increase the help to Ireland. This causes a huge backbench rebellion led by Benjamin Disraeli, and it brings down Peel's government. Then the Liberals come in under Lord John Russell. And the Liberals are firm believers in what is in laissez-faire, which is leave them alone. There shouldn't be government insistence. And so they remove the various public works that Peel have put in place. Now, I should say this was not done because they hated the Irish. This was done because they were principal believers in laissez-faire capitalism. It was the wrong thing to do, but this wasn't any sort of anti-Irish attempt to commit genocide, as Irish Americans like to claim as a certain sort of Irish Republican does. It was a terrible the British government under the Liberals completely mishandled the situation, but it was a mishandling the situation. It wasn't anything malicious. Now, this causes the population of Ireland to drop both from deaths as well as migration. Now, probably many people here will know that the large numbers of Irish people went to America. They also went to Canada and Australia, but the majority of them actually came to Great Britain. They just came to the mainland, which is one of the reasons why you have a significant number of people in this country who are of Irish descent. And in fact, I believe there are probably more British people with Irish passports on the British mainland today than there are actually Irish passports in the Republic of Irish citizens with Irish passports in the Republic of Ireland because of that migration. Now, the issue of home rule from Daniel O'Connell's time is sort of low level. And then in the 1860s, you have the revival of it with, just a second, with a gentleman called Isaac Butt. Isaac Butt is an Irish Conservative. He was a supporter of Daniel O'Connell, and he, in 1870, establishes what is called the Home Government Association. This is the first iteration of what will become the Irish Parliamentary Party. He is firmly in the mould of Daniel O'Connell. He wants the return of the Irish Parliament, but he does not want it to be independent of Britain. Outside the British Empire, he wants it to become essentially what Australia and Canada and New Zealand and South Africa will become in about a couple of decades' time. And he very much is a very strong believer in the British Empire. During the Zulu War, he's leader of what the Home Rule Association by then had become the Home Rule League. And he opposes an attempt by some of the more hardline nationalist Republican elements to disrupt debates around, I think it was Islam Wana, because he stated that this is a matter of importance to the empire and it cannot be disrupted. So he is a representative within the home rule movement of an idea that they want Ireland to have legislative independence and also a degree of national independence within the British Empire. There's roughly two. This comes in sort of two types. You've got the Butts type who want this sort of independence within the empire, and you've got some of the more moderate ones who want legislative independence, but they want MPs still at Westminster, so they technically want Ireland to remain a part of the UK, but with its own domestic affairs under the control of the Dublin Parliament. However, the other part of the Home Rule movement is Fenians. They are hardline nationalists, and they want to take control. And they want Irish independence, and they just see Home Rule as the first step for complete independence and becoming a republic. And in the early 1880s, you see them really take power with Parnell as leader. So Parnell becomes leader in 1879, 1880, and during the late 1870s, early 1880s, you have sort of landlord wars where there are uprising by tenants against landlords. Now, there's a simple problem in Ireland at this point that the landlords, who are largely a tenancy, are absentee landlords. They're living in Britain, or they're living in places like Dublin or Belfast, and the estates are being run by agents, and the agents are, shall we say, not necessarily doing the best job of it. And so the whole thing has become a big issue by the late 1870s, early 1880s, and so you have sort of riots and you have elements of civil unrest in Ireland at this point, which Parnell and the Irish Parliamentary Party, which is what the Home Rule's leaders become at this point, are strongly supporting the people going up against landlords. And
Aaron, this is an excellent summary of what we're going to talk about. But I think you've got us up to the main topic for this evening, and I thought partly to give your voice a rest for a couple of minutes. I'd ask Mitch if he had anything to add about the stuff we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, a lot of my reference of the Irish history comes from, because you have Anglo-Normans, of course, and Richard de Clare, or as we know, Strongbow, which of course that's where like the famous beer you can get, like you can order Strongbow. You've got Protestant ascendancy now. Yeah, you have plenty of military officers who are an offspring of that, namely Iron Duke's namesake, being one of them. Daniel O'Connell, he's people will know him as because there's that famous quote: "Being born in the stables does not make you a horse." Or I'm paraphrasing. Daniel O'Connell said that about the Duke of Wellington one time back in 1828 or somewhere around that time. Back when, of course, Wellesley was our Prime Minister. Then, as for you have, you take, for example, some of the railways built around my neck of the woods. A lot of it was built by navvies who came from Ireland, and
lots of the canals as well, Mitch.
Yeah, so
in fact, I think it was the canals where they originally got their name, because navvy is short for navigator.
Yeah, I thought it was reference to. I thought it was going to be something like they used to work in the navy or something. So fair enough.
No, I think it was when they were digging canals and they were known as navigators, because those canals were mostly built by navigation companies. I think they were mostly called. Of course, and by the time we get to the 1880s, which is where Aaron had got us to, there's a certain amount of terrorism going on in London. The Fenians were planting bombs in different places. And I'm sure Aaron was going to mention also that two of the top British civil servants in Ireland were murdered in Phoenix Park, I believe.
Yeah, I was just going to mention so Patrick Pearse, who's like a famous Irish nationalist, his father was born in Birmingham and grew up around my neck in Birmingham. So,
there were tons of Irish people in London. I mean, where I was a child in Bermondsey, which is in inner South London, on the other side of the river from the East End, we had a huge Catholic church just next to us because there were loads of Irish people around there, or Irish descent people anyway.
One thing I would just add that what Mitch mentioned, it's an interesting thing. If you look at the fathers of many of the leaders of the Easter Rising in 1916, they have English or Scottish fathers, and it's their mothers that make them into Irish nationalists. It's a strange thing about them that they have many of them have many English, almost direct English or Scottish ancestry in terms of fathers, in some cases grandfathers. And they are from loyalist families, and yet they turn into not just Irish nationalists but Irish Republicans. a strange quirk.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth pointing out for people in the chat and people who watch this later on that most of the Protestant Ulster people were in Ulster, which is in the north of Ireland, which is why even to this day, Northern Ireland remains British. But we're going to come on to that in due course. I would also just say to people in the chat, if you want to ask questions, you can send us a super chat question via Entropy. It's pinned at the top of the chat, and we will answer any of those we get at the end of the stream. Sorry, Aaron, I didn't mean to stop you for too long. So you've got us up to Parnell taking over the Irish Home Rule Party, and I presume you're going to talk a little bit about its effect on the British Liberal Party, who were kind of split over this issue, weren't they?
Yeah, actually, well, before the split takes place around 1885-86. So in the early 1880s, what's happened is the Home Rule Party has risen in Ireland, and Parnell, when he becomes leader, essentially remakes it into a proper political party. But it was very loose. It wasn't really a proper party in a sense of the way the Liberals and Conservatives were. And this means that Parnell is very much able to use the Irish Parliamentary Party as a proper political force, and it starts. And because of the use of violence, a lot of businessmen in Britain who would have voted for the Liberals in the early 1870s end up voting for the Tories, and so the Liberals are being squeezed in Ireland out, and so at the same time there is this unrest over the landlord wars, and so Gladstone comes to the view by about 1883-84 that there needs to be a home rule bill, that there needs to be a home rule to Ireland, and this causes a split. This split is actually a non-ideological, sort of crosses ideological lines within the Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party at this point is roughly has two wings. You've got the old sort of conservative wing, which are the descendants of the Whigs, and then you have the more radical wing, which are which are sort of very much more sort of left wing. They're not socialists, but they are broadly of the left, and they're particularly at this point led by Joseph Chamberlain, former Lord Mayor of Birmingham. He became an MP in, I think, 1879, and he was in Gladstone's cabinet, and the leader of the sort of Whigs, the Whig Liberals who oppose Home Rule, is actually the Duke of Devonshire, whose brother was one of the men murdered in Phoenix Park. And so when Gladstone comes to the view of supporting Home Rule, Chamberlain and Devonshire are firmly opposed to it. They resign from the cabinet, and then they resign from the Liberals in 1885-86, and they form what is known as the Liberal Unionist Party, who will, from this point up until about 1885, sit as sort of allies of the Conservatives in a rough outside of office, and then from 1895 until 1912, they will be effectively firm political alliance with the Conservatives, and the Tories and the Liberal Unionists at this point are known collectively as the Unionists. And the Conservatives then come into power in 1885 for a short period, and 1887 till 1892 under first government of Lord Salisbury, who, if anyone wants to know, that my profile picture is Lord Salisbury, and he's firmly opposed to Home Rule. And because of the civil unrest, the Conservatives bring in what are coercion acts designed to bring things under control. Now, during the Salisbury government, there's something called Pigot forgeries, where these are forged letters that claim that Parnell supported the murders in Phoenix Park. these are something discovered to be false, and Parnell sort of wins a sort of great media victory. And this sort of angers quite a lot of unionists because they felt they rightly feel they've been gulled, and they feel this has given the home rulers a great media victory. Now, I should say at this point that the Home Rule, the Irish Home Rule Party, was an all-Ireland popular movement, but so was the Unionists. They were an all-Ireland, cross-class, popular movement in Ireland. The idea was popularised by people that the Unionist cause in Ireland, the anti-Home Rule cause, was solely the preserve of the Protestant ascendancy in the aristocracy. Was not true. There were plenty of working class people supporting it. Obviously, in what is now in Northern Ireland, Ulster, there's a strong anti-Home Rule position support, and by pardon me, and at this point, at this point, after this, the Conservatives are in a degree of unpopularity, and then there's some troubles in Ireland in 1880. Things are sort of going well for the Home Rulers, and then a scandal hits Parnell, which is that he has been having an affair with Kitty O'Shea, the wife of Captain William O'Shea, who is a former army officer and an Irish parliamentary MP for Galway. And then, former MP by this point. And he sues for, he starts the divorce proceedings and claims that, points out that Parnell is having an affair with his wife. This completely destroys Parnell's career, and he is forced to resign, and it splits the Home Rulers for a decade, pretty much. And it isn't until the early Edwardian period when I
was just going to say, Aaron, it's worth pointing out that obviously in the 1880s, it was a big deal to be having an affair, especially with a married woman. And of course, on top of that, Parnell was a Catholic, so that makes it even more serious.
Oh no, Parnell was a Protestant. He was.
Was he? I didn't know that.
Church of Ireland. He was actually himself ascendancy.
Ah, that's interesting. I know that some ascendancy guys were pretty much on the side of the Home Rulers, and I think it's also worth pointing out that the Home Rule that was being offered at this time by Gladstone. Again, it would have included Ireland staying in the British Empire, and the Irish Parliament wouldn't have been responsible for things like foreign affairs and defence and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it isn't until from the first 4 Home Rule Acts all have it that Ireland will still send MPs to Westminster. So it's still very firmly a part of the British Empire and pretty much part of the United Kingdom, with legislative independence for very much domestic matters.
Michael K, 19th century fan, is saying Parnell was a Protestant, but his affair cost him the support of the Catholic clergy, which of course it would have done back in those days.
Yeah, he at the time that the scandal broke, he was very much courting Cardinal Manning, the most important Catholic clergyman in the British Isles, and at this point it had become very clear to anybody watching that the two most important sort of ideologies in Ireland were Roman Catholicism and Irish nationalism. Mm-hmm. And so combining those two was a way to win for the Home Rulers. During the 1890s, I'd say the Home Party is split, and Gladstone loses power. Salisbury loses power. Gladstone and the Liberals come back in 1892. Gladstone tries to pass another Home Rule bill. This is, this would have been the third one. He tried to pass another one between the previous two Salisbury governments, and that failed. And then that fails. He resigns. Lord Rosebery becomes Prime Minister. Rosebery is a terrible Prime Minister. There's a general election in 1895, and then the Unionists win under Salisbury. And the Unionists are in power from 1895 to 1905, and Salisbury is Prime Minister until 1902, and then he is succeeded by Arthur Balfour. Balfour has been in Salisbury's 2 previous governments, the Secretary for Ireland, and so he's involved in Irish affairs. And during Salisbury and Balfour's government, they practiced what is called constructive unionism, with the aim, in Salisbury's words, to kill Home Rule with kindness. And they damn near do it. They bring in various reforms and for the rural poor. They bring in land reform. They essentially give the home rulers what they want in terms of reforms in Ireland. And this means that the home rule cause is actually in decline throughout the Edwardian period, even after Redmond has reunited the home rulers. And so the home rulers still have parliamentary representation. However, because of the Unionist alliance and because of the Unionist alliance, they can't hold the balance of power, because what had happened in the 1880s was that because of the loss of Liberal support, the Liberals couldn't form a majority government, so they're having to rely on Irish parliamentary votes.
This is Aaron. This is what you were talking about when you were talking about Joseph Chamberlain and people leaving the Liberal Party because they were liberal imperialists, as they were known, and joining the Conservatives, who then become the Conservative and Unionist Party, I do believe.
Yeah, they become the Conservative Unionist Party in 1912. So the Liberal Unionists and the Conservatives are 2 separate parties until that point, and then they unify. However, they are effectively the same party by the time of the 1906 general election. There's very little to separate them fundamentally. And so by the time Balfour comes to the end of his government, he stupidly decides to resign as Prime Minister and let the Liberals take power when he didn't need to. One of many idiotic decisions he makes during the course of his short premiership.
He was known as the Divine Arthur, I do believe, wasn't he?
Yes, he was very.
He was not like Lord Salisbury. Lord Salisbury was a very practical man who looked at just about every question, what's best for Britain, really. And Balfour was a much more airy-fairy kind of individual, which I think is where he gets his name, the Divine Arthur.
Yeah.
Carry on,
I was just saying, because the thing about Parnell, one thing that you had, for example, in the aftermath of his affair, one thing he did was he married Kitty O'Shea. Matt was like the final nail in the coffin for him having any sort of moral authority in terms of his role as being the main spokesman for Irish Home Rule. And then you had, I think, after you had the likes of Lord Rosebery and Asquith later on, who basically look upon the idea of Irish Home Rule as just a electoral poison chalice, I suppose. They just look upon it as a matter of very unpopular, because of course you got Ulster being very hardline against it, whereas you've got this question, but then it's also a matter of later on you end up having a position where the Liberals are in. On one hand, you have Gladstone, who's very much entranced by Parnell, but then later on, you have the Liberals grow to rely a lot more on Irish home rulers to have a functioning government. But at the same time, it's like, well, as I said, you had an exodus of some brilliant people like Joseph Chamberlain, like one of the greatest prime ministers we never had. So it's just a matter of the Liberals. On one hand, it's splitting them, but also, to be fair, I'm not a big fan of the Liberal Party at this time, where they didn't hold certain things as sacred as they should have been. Because, for example, you have certainly like Lloyd George and others, you have those who ready to take a sledgehammer to, for example, the House of Lords. Now, the House of Lords, you can imagine, even if the House of Commons were to try and push through Home Rule, the House of Lords would be dead set against it. So So I could imagine, even if like it wasn't for the budget, I can imagine, let's say, hypothetically, the Liberal Party probably would have tried to take a sledgehammer to the House of Lords, because, as we all know, the House of Lords would inevitably veto any sort of home rule, because of course, constitutionally, it would screw over Ulster, and of course, the whole point of this, like, because one thing about Ulster is, of course, there's an iron law with identities that if you live on a borderland, like the men and women of Ulster do, going against the Gaelic Irish, as it's an iron rule that if you live on the border, you are the most identitarian. So in a way, you could argue that the men and women of Ulster are the most British of the British, because they live on the borderland. They've always had to live with that siege mentality where they've had to deal with the Liberal Party, aspects of the Tory Party not being too fond of them. And then you got, of course, on the other hand, they're being attacked by Irish Republicans who look upon them as colonisers.
Yeah, very much so. And one thing I will say is, I didn't mention this before, but during the 1880s, one thing that Parnell succeeds in doing with Gladstone is that during it's the Third Reform Act, he has the thing written in, he has things sort of done in such a way that the Unionist vote in Ulster is actually suppressed. And so from the 1880s up until the election of 1918, after the passage of the Representation of People Act 1918, the majority of MPs in Ulster are Irish Parliamentary Party MPs. And it isn't until 1918 you get the majority of Ulster MPs being Unionist. And there is this unwillingness among Home Rulers, even people like, for example, John Redmond, who will probably come to some prominence in the shortly, where he was very much willing to compromise with the Unionists. He, for example, he was very much in the mould of the Home Ruler who wanted Ireland to stay as a part of the UK but have legislative independence. He didn't understand or understand that the Unionists in Ulster were effectively a separate nation, and there's a sort of inability among Home Rulers to it's not so much that they won't engage with the Ulster Unionists. To say they just don't understand that they exist as a people, as it were. It's an inability to understand, and that by the way is something that is continues very strongly among Irish Republicans. Now, by the time, sorry, Jake.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Aaron. Obviously, we're going to move on shortly to the situation from 1912-ish onwards, when you had the Curragh mutiny or the potential mutiny of the British Army, and that sort of stuff. I was just going to say, the person I would have liked to have had on this stream would have been Lady of Shalott, of course, because Lady of Shalott was a good loyalist Belfast lady, although she's got friends on both sides of the border. But sadly, no one's heard from Lady of Shalott since late February, as far as I know. I certainly haven't, and I have asked other people. So, yeah, I wish Lady of Shalott was with us today, because obviously she'd give us stuff from the horse's mouth, if you see what I mean. But yeah, sorry, Aaron, you carry on.
Oh yeah, now so the Liberals come to power in 1905 under Henry Campbell Bannerman, and then they call a general election in 1906, and this is a landslide election. It's the Liberals have a huge majority. And the Liberals, by this point, have regarded Home Rule as given up on Home Rule. They have no interest in it. They regard it as a sort of ring in their nose, which allows the Home Rulers to sort of pull them around. So when they are elected in 1906, they have no interest whatsoever in involving themselves in Home Rule. However, there's a general election called there's a People's Budget in 1909. This is rejected by the House of Lords. The Liberal government then go to the country in January 1910 on the issue. However, this general election is extremely close. The Liberals have, just wait a second, let me just get the numbers up. The Liberals come out of the general election with 274 seats, and the Unionists have 272 seats.
I was just going to say, that election was very anti-Tory because I believe the Labour Party had a pact with the Liberals, and in a way, like, it was a matter of, it's kind of a bit of a, sorry for the deflection, but it's going to be like, but you could argue like that was the main thing was the Liberal Party didn't have a long-term future because in the end, Labour ended up replacing them, but also the Liberal Party, they didn't really solve. How would I articulate? Basically, they didn't solve a discontent forming at the time. So in the end, like the Liberal Party, especially after the First World War, they just get massive screwed up, and the Home Rule stuff is just a massive powder keg waiting to kick off. Where the Liberal Party don't want to tread down that road, but at the same time, it's like, well, events transpire later on that they have to go down that road, especially when John Redmond, especially is, what would be the word to describe him? Forceful, I suppose. But he was very much like he was very much banging the drum quite a lot, and he would, in a lot of ways, he got what he wanted. But also, he underestimated ulster unionist opposition later on down the road. So,
yeah, I just should have said this is right about the Labour, but about 1906, there's the Lib Lab Pact, which is negotiated in about 1904 between Ramsay MacDonald, who's a senior Labour MP at that point, and Herbert Gladstone, Sir William Gladstone, who is the Liberal chief whip, and that's, as Mitch mentions, enables really does screw the Tories over at the 1906 general election. And the Liberals are trying to bring up various reforms. They do actually bring, in this period, quite a few reforms, the old age pension.
This is, Aaron, this is also the time, of course, that Winston Churchill deserts the Conservatives and crosses the floor and joins the Liberal Party.
Yeah, he does that in 1904. Yeah, and then when the Liberals come to power in 1906, he is when the Liberals win the general election, his first posting is the Colonial Office under Lord Elgin, and then he goes to the Board of Trade, then Home Office, then of course the Admiralty, and he's obviously at the Admiralty when the First World War breaks out. Churchill actually comes into this during the sort of the Home Rule crisis of 2014. But I'll come to that in a moment. So the Liberals, they go to the country, as I say, in January 1910. The general election is really close, and so the Liberals are the largest party by two seats, but they do not have a majority, so they have to come to terms with the Irish Parliamentary Party under Redmond. And Redmond says to them simply, "We will vote for you, and we will keep you in power if you give us Home Rule." And so the Liberals under Asquith start the process of bringing in Home Rule, and they have absolutely no parliamentary mandate to do this, and they don't have a parliamentary mandate when Asquith goes back to the country in December 1910, where the difference between the Tories and the Liberals is reduced to 1 seat difference. The Liberals have 272 seats and the Conservatives have 271. And the whole of that election was fought on the People's Budget. It wasn't on Home Rule. And so when Home Rule comes forward in sort of 1911, after the passage of the 1911 Parliament Act to get the People's Budget through, the Unionists in Ireland, particularly in modern day Ulster, what was now modern day Northern Ireland, are absolutely outraged. They see this quite rightly as the British government imposing it on them. And the two most important leaders of this are Sir Edward Carson, who is a Dublin MP, and Sir James Craig, who is an Ulster MP. And they are vocal in their opposition. And this has a real big upswell of support. And at the same time, Balfour, who's remained leader of the Unionists since losing power in since leaving power in 1905 and losing power, he actually losing his seat initially in 1906. He resigns, and the Conservatives elect Andrew Bonar Law. Now, Andrew Bonar Law is actually interesting because he's the first British Prime Minister until Boris Johnson not to have been born in the British Isles. He was born in Canada. His father was from Coleraine in Northern Ireland, and then he grew up with family in Glasgow. He is dyed-in-the-wool unionist. And in fact, he said by the time of 1914 to Asquith, the only two things that matter to me in politics is tariff reform and Ulster. And so you have this alliance between the Unionists, and then after 1912, the Tories under Bonar Law with the Unionists in Ireland, under the Ulster Unionists in Ireland under Craig and Carson. And there's a very famous event in 1912 called the Ulster Covenant, where in Belfast City Hall, a huge number of Unionists, not just politicians, but ordinary people, come and sign this covenant saying they will to defend the Union, defend Ireland, particularly Ulster, as a part of Britain. And at the same time, there's a thing called the British Covenant, which is the British equivalent, saying they are going to defend Ulster's right to be British and Ireland's place in the Union. And the tensions start to build over the course of 1912 and 1913. The government makes it clear it is not going to give up, it is not going to stop, and because it has Parliament Act 1911, it can force the House of Lords to back down. The Irish Home Rulers are very happy about this. They can see Home Rule coming down see the Home Rule on the horizon, and the more extreme elements of the Irish part of the Irish Home Rule movement, and particularly those Fenians and the growing Irish Republicans, can see this as the future of Irish independence as an independent republic. And both the Unionists and the Nationalists start establishing paramilitary forces. The Unionists in Northern Ireland, in Ulster, established the Ulster Volunteers, which later becomes the Ulster Volunteer Force, and they start importing arms from notably Germany. And there is the famous there's the gunnery incident in 1913, where there is very successful. They invade the government and they bring in these arms. The Irish Volunteers do the same thing, and are now the Irish Volunteers are not able to evade the government, and there's a fight between British troops and these Irish nationalists, and the Irish Volunteers become in 1913 Irish Citizen Army. They're particularly involved in the trade union movement with two Irish socialist Labour leaders, James Connolly and Jim. I've forgotten his other name now, but he ends up being sent off to America after the Dublin lockout. The Dublin lockout in 1913, in which is heavily involved with the Irish Citizen Army, and so you have tensions growing through. Yes, thank you, James Larkin, that's the chap. And things are getting really tense in Ireland. There's a fear of a civil war, and at the same time, you have Duke has already mentioned this. You have the Curragh incident, where in early it's the spring of 1914, the War Office mistakenly sends a memo to the British Army, to the Curragh barracks in just outside of Dublin, I believe it is, telling them they're going to be used to enforce Home Rule in Ulster. This is a mistake. This shouldn't have been sent. At which point the officers of Curragh, not wanting to commit mutiny, being loyal officers, offered their resignations. And this causes a big stink, because obviously Duke can never go into this in a lot more detail, but a lot of the British Army officers were either Anglo-Irish Protestants themselves, or had family family in Ireland.
The Anglo-Irish ascendancy people, and also the Anglo-Irish in Northern Ireland, were as near as the British Army came to a kind of Protestant Junker class, as I believe Mitch pointed out earlier. They were very much as close as the British Army ever got to that. So it was very serious for the British Army, because it would have led to the loss of a very high proportion of their officers, including a lot of senior officers, like colonels and generals and so on.
Yeah. And now, I mentioned Churchill was involved at this point. Churchill, obviously, in 1914, is chief, he's First Lord of the Admiralty, and he sends Royal Navy ships. He has a plan to send Royal Navy ships to Belfast to ensure, to open fire on the Belfast docks, if there is any any armed uprising by the Unionists against the government.
That's such a typical Winston Churchill plan, to open fire on our own people. So typical of Winston Churchill.
Yeah, no, I should say this is all this bit of the crisis that's going on, where Churchill sends the ships off the coast of Northern Ireland, is taking place in the early stages of the July crisis 1914, with the outbreak of the First World War. So these events are all going on, and there are roundtable talks held at Buckingham Palace trying to come up with a solution. And just before the First World War breaks out, there is a sort of roughly a very tentative solution, which is that Ulster will be excluded from Home Rule settlement, with a question of would it be a 6-county Ulster or a full province of 9 counties Ulster, and that was probably the compromise they would have come to if the war hadn't taken place. However, the Home Rule law is passed just before the war breaks out. However, it is suspended when the war does break out, and remains suspended until, effectively, it never comes into force after that, because of the war and then the events of the Easter Rising in 1916.
I think it's worth saying, Aaron, that although it's largely forgotten today, this was a very, very serious political crisis for the Liberal government, and it had some effect on making them join the First World War, because it was a way of getting rid of this crisis.
Yes,
because it really was a really serious crisis. I mean, as you just said, Aaron, you had idiot Churchill who wants to use the Royal Navy to open fire on the Ulster Loyalists. You've got probably about a third of the officers in the British Army were ready to resign, if not to actually mutiny. It was a really serious crisis, and it had some effect on some Liberals in pushing them into joining the First World War, because, of course, no one in 1914 realised what a terrible war that was going to be.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And you had a situation where if they hadn't, if it was very sitting possibility that if the war hadn't occurred, if, let's say, Archduke Franz Ferdinand isn't shot, that you would either have had a proper constitutional crisis, because Andrew Bonar Law and the Unionists were threatening to vote against the Army Bill. Now, the Army Bill, for those who don't know, it's a bill that's passed by every Parliament it's been passed since the 1690s, and it gives 1705, I think it is, since we're in Queen Anne, and it essentially gives them the political legitimacy of the existence of the standing army of the British Army. Yeah. And until Bonar Law suggested, nobody had since it's pretty much it came to force had ever even suggested voting against it.
Yeah, no, it was potentially, if World War I hadn't fortuitously come along, if that's the right word for World War I, it was potentially an enormous British constitutional crisis. And you could have seen, I mean, everyone always says the British Army is one of the least political armies you'll find, but they really were on the edge of having a serious mutiny in just before the First World War over trying to force Ulster into a united Ireland. And
it's also
giving it home rule.
Yeah, and by 1914, because I think it was like 1893, there was one Home Rule bill that got vetoed by the House of Lords, whereas in 1914 that couldn't happen. So it was a matter of Bonar Law and the Unionists. They didn't have that. You can imagine if a Liberal and if the Liberals and John Redmond were really adamant on just forcing this down, Edward Carson, let alone the British Army, would just like go full on.
Oh yeah, no. The saying was, Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right. So it could have been a full-on civil war in Ulster in 1914, but for the First World War. I mean, Fionn McCumkell in the chat is saying that, and this is true, that loads of the Ulster volunteers ended up actually joining the British Army and fighting the Germans, but so did loads of people in Southern Ireland. I mean, bear in mind, there were lots of Irish regiments in the British Army. And the Irish regiments in 1901, the Irish Guards were created because of the gallantry of the Irish regiments in South Africa during the Anglo-Boer War. So
I think
this was a big deal.
200,000 Irishmen, I believe it was, who I think it was like very volunteered, like those 200,000 Irishmen. I don't know how many were drafted, because of course conscription was a tricky issue. Of course, at this.
Yeah, and conscription didn't come in until 1917. So all the people who joined up in 1914 and 1915, they were all volunteers.
Yeah, there's a famous interview. I forget the guy's name, but there's a famous Irish soldier who was interviewed back in the 1980s, and he'll just say, he pretty much exemplified the Irish who were in the British Army, but they were loyal to the country. A lot of them, because one thing to factor is at that time. First of all, Dublin, when the Easter Rising happened, for example, most Dubliners were just generally with the British Empire because, of course, Dublin's economy was massively dependent on the Empire in the same way that Glasgow, for example, was built up because of the Empire.
And also, up until the 1916 Easter Rising, Mitch, I don't think there was anything like a majority, even in Southern Ireland, for breaking away from Britain.
At least not in a violent way, because it's like you generally have lots of James Connolly and Patrick Pearse. It was only I never understood this. Perhaps it'll be answered why Ireland really went stirby crazy after we executed them after the Easter Rising. But the general picture was you have, for example, and as I said, you had 200,000 Irish volunteers who, they were genuinely loyal. There was no problem with desertion at all. They were damn loyal to us. This is I've gone off Mosley, so I won't play apologies. I know, but Mosley often said, the main reason he took his stance regarding Ireland, which was basically he didn't like the Black and Tans, a lot of the stuff we did, was he cited, many of the Irishmen who fought against us later on were those who fought for us in the First World War. So it was one of those things where there was a lot of feelings on both sides, especially after the first.
Part of the reason for the 1916 Ulster Rising was that those guys wanted to force people to take sides. That was part of what they were trying to do.
Yeah, because it's like the only. I think the only one we couldn't get rid of was Edmund de Valera, but that's because he's an American citizen, so it would have caused problems there. But of the others, you have James Connolly, Joseph Plunkett, I believe it was. Clark. I can't remember his first name. Clark.
Tom Clark.
Yeah, Thomas Clark. That was it. Yeah, you have all these others. Yeah, you just generally had a situation where, at that time, I think they tried to do a stadium uprising in the countryside as well, but it didn't even last a day because most Irish people were just like, we don't want any trouble. Although they were of a John Redmond's kind of stage of things, they weren't at all wanting any sort of violence or even just a violent breakup with Britain. They were just things will come in their own time and we'll live with what happens. Whereas what happened was How would you sum it up? But yeah, it was a situation where everything just went
polarized. The
pear-shaped.
Easter Rising really polarized the situation, but of course that was what the guys who did the Easter Rising wanted to do, was to polarize the situation.
Yeah,
That was part of their aim.
it's like I don't know, I mean, I have mixed feelings about Patrick Pearce. On one hand, yeah, I mean, as an Englishman, I'm not going to like Patrick Pearce, trying to tear away Ireland from the Union. But at the same time, it's like, I think he's like one of the few Irish Republican types I can slightly respect, just because he's the only one who tried to bring back Irish Gaelic in terms of revival. But at the same time, the Gaelic revival movement, yeah, you can a lot of that was just like very radical, full of like former Irish Republican brother types / later on IRA. So it's just and
Yeah,
Gaelic,
I see that. I see that, Mitch.
yeah. So it's just yeah.
But I do think people don't realise just how important this stuff was in 1914, and of course it's been forgotten because the much greater disaster of the First World War overtook it. But it was a huge crisis, and it's probably why we are where we are today, in the sense of Northern Ireland still being British. And part of the reason I decided we'd do this stream is like, when I see people arguing that Britain should give up Northern Ireland, I don't see how that is different from leftists who claim, Australia is stolen, Canada is stolen, New Zealand is stolen. Even the USA, this is exactly the same arguments these people put forward. And to me, it's nonsense. I mean, I did two tours in Northern Ireland with the British Army when I was a very young man, long time ago in the last century, when it was quite dangerous there. And, I've had mates who got killed there, and they didn't get killed, so we should give it up.
Yeah, it's because the thing about the situation with Ireland is it's kind of like what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, like two brotherly peoples, I suppose you could say, who are tearing each other up. Because I mean, it's like, I mean, I know about Dublin, but I don't know about the rest of Ireland. Plenty of Irish people have English blood in them. That's just common intermixing, but also the fact that most Irish people, they speak English as well. It's just a matter of
Mitch, my mother was born in Southern Ireland. She was born in Southern Ireland, but I'm not Irish. Yeah. I mean, I'm an Englishman. If not,
I mean, I've got members of my family. I have members of my family who are married to Irishmen, so it's one of the things where there's a sense of, well, in an ideal world, we would have just solved this issue. Like, someone's asking, like, I think Duke Valentino was asking, should we have just given home rule and thereby forestalled any chance of an Easter Rising, and later on the IRA waging the war in the latter 1910s? Whereas I'm sitting there thinking, well, it's one of those things where I'm biased because I'm just saying, look, I mean Arthur Balfour was one who said Ireland would struggle by herself leaving the Union, which is actually what I'd say what has happened since. It's just a matter of the Irish ever since independence. It's kind of like they don't fully know what to do, and especially since like the 1960s, because I would say there's two different types of Ireland. You've got traditional Ireland, which is kind of like Catholic, like old folk tales about Cuchulainn or whatever. But then you got basically the Irish Republican anti-British identity, which is just full-on leftism.
Oh, look, the provisional IRA, and I'm sure that Aaron's going to come on to this in a minute. They didn't all start off this way, but the provisional IRA, the modern provisional IRA, and Sinn Féin are their political wing. The leaders of that are Marxists. They're all about Brits out, Somalians in. They're fully in favour of mass immigration into Ireland.
Yeah, I've heard like the hypothesis that apparently if Patrick Pearse had lived to die a natural death, perhaps what would have happened is you would have like a sort of Irish fascism develop from that Gaelic revival, But
There
because
were
he got
some, there were some
Yeah.
quite fashy people in the original IRA.
Yeah,
Although I think Aaron's going to tell us that it was a bit more split than being just one way, but there were certainly some fairly fashy people in the original IRA. But the modern provisional IRA is a Marxist organisation at its top for sure.
yeah, and actually, what I do is I just talk a bit about what happens in Ireland during World War One, and then I can actually come back to this with the leaders of the Easter Rising, where they, in many ways, sort of prefigure what happens in the IRA up since 1919. So when World War One breaks out, the Ulster Division, obviously the Ulster Volunteers, all join up, and they form the 36th Ulster Division, which is very famous for its actions at the Somme. But also, John Redmond goes on a big sort of tour of Ireland, calling for Irish Home Rulers to join up, and they do. And there are massive numbers of Irish Home Rulers and Catholics who join up and fight in World War One. They are, and they serve in they serve on the Somme as well. And they have a great deal. They're very good, very sort of honourable service on the Western Front alongside the Unionists. Now, throughout the First World War, there are attempts to sort of come to some kind of settlement over Home Rule, with the British government committed to bringing Home Rule in force when the war's over. This sort of comes to head in 1917, where there are various conferences, and what happens is Lloyd George tries to play both sides off each other. They learn about this, and the whole thing falls apart. He is at that point completely distrusted by both the Unionists, particularly by Carson, but also by Redmond. And Redmond, who dies in 1918, in I think May, he dies completely disillusioned with Lloyd George. Now, there's an attempt. Now, as Duke pretty mentioned, conscription was not enforced in Ireland until at the beginning of the war. It is brought in 1918 in the spring, in I think March, April. It causes a huge, massive political controversy, and it sort of revives the sort of the Home Rule movement. It also revives the nationalist Republicans in Southern Ireland after the failure of the Easter Rising. Now, just to come to the Easter Rising. Easter Rising takes place in Easter 1916 in Dublin and some small areas outside of Ireland that Mitch mentioned. They didn't come to much. The leadership, when they say the fight is going to take place and they start to rise up, lie to the men under them. They don't tell them that what's going to happen is going to happen. They play act that it's going to be merely a drill, and then when the fighting starts, they lie to the men, telling them that Jim Larkin is coming back to America and the German troops have landed on the coast and then marching to support them, all whilst they're just losing. And the leadership are very, as I say, very ideologically diverse. You have sort of Pierce and somebody like Tom Clark, who would, if they had lived would have effectively become fascists. You had some strange, because you had some sort of absolute monarchists who, in fact, wanted a Prussian prince to be the ruler of Ireland for them, and then you had sort of socialists led by James Connolly, and in fact, Connolly tells his men just before the Easter Rising breaks out, keep your guns because we're going to need them afterwards. He was absolutely certain that if they won, though he didn't think they would, if they did win, there was going to be an Irish Civil War with his socialists versus everybody else. And so you have this deeply sort of strange grouping who are only united by wanting to see an independent Ireland as a republic. And this then translates into the IRA in its various forms until the establishment of the Prussian IRA in 1969. Now, the Easter Rising fails, and the Irish public turn against the execution of the leaders, partly because the Irish nationalists and Irish Republicans are very good at PR. They turn these men from political lunatics who got many of their own men killed by Langton into young martyrs who were also very Catholic, even though James Connolly wasn't himself Catholic, he was an avowed atheist. And this sort of turns a significant portion of the population in Southern Ireland against not just the Unionists, not just continuation of Ireland as part of Britain, but also against the Irish Parliamentary Party. So when you have the 1918 general election in Ireland, the Irish Parliamentary Party is outside of Ulster, pretty much wiped out. Whilst in Ulster, it gets battered by the Unionists, who now, because the fact that all working class men have got the votes, they now are the majority representation in Parliament from Ulster. And one of the reasons why so many Irish Parliamentary Party MPs aren't re-elected is because many of them hadn't had any opposition in their constituencies. Because the Irish Parliamentary Party had such a dominance in many constituencies, particularly in Southern Ireland, they'd never actually, some of the MPs had never had anybody stand against them. And so in 1918, when the election happens and Sinn Féin puts members in there, puts people up against them, they win. Now, I should also point out that Sinn Féin did use violence. They did have, for example, armed men standing outside certain polling stations in Southern Ireland, threatening people who, if they voted the other way. And they also did things like they used to go around to sort of, particularly in rural areas, attack farmers and then making a huge amount of noise and generally like a nuisance themselves, pretending to be members of the Irish Parliamentary Party, which then annoyed the farmers, and the farmers ended up voting for Sinn Féin out of pure spite. Now, between the general election 1918 and March 1919, there is a continual the hardliners among Irish nationalists and also the Irish Republicans are determined to fight a war, and then this breaks out in what's known as the Anglo-Irish War, the Irish War of Independence, whichever you prefer. This begins when Dan Breen and a couple of other early members of the IRA ambush members of the Royal Irish Constabulary. Now, one thing I do want to put out at this point about the Royal Irish Constabulary, they are, whilst the senior leadership are Protestant ascendancy, the rank and file are Irish Catholic men. They are not imported from England or the rest of the British Isles. They are Irishmen and they are Catholic and they are also loyal. And during the War of Independence, they are the main targets of the IRA. They are shot, their families are threatened, their barracks are burned down, and they are driven out of their homes and out of, in many cases, they are driven out of Ireland itself. Quite a few of them went up to Northern Ireland after partition in 1921 and 22 and joined the Royal Ulster Constabulary, but many of them actually went out into the Empire. So, for example, the Palestine Police Force, the Palestine Police is established in 1922 in Mandatory Palestine. Many of the officers who joined up in 1922 are former RIC men. Also in Southern Rhodesia, in the British South Africa Police, the acronym being the BSAP, in the 20s and 30s, large numbers of RIC men go to Southern Rhodesia and join them, meaning that by the 40s and 50s, there's quite a number of Irish Catholic officers in the BSAP, and being Irish and being Catholic and of Irish descent does, in fact, in some cases, help you get promotion in the BSAP in the 40s and early 50s.
I think, Aaron, pretty much the same thing happened with the Hong Kong police force as well. Yeah,
very much. It happens quite a lot. If you look at what happens with a lot of the sort of colonial police forces, as the British leave them, the officers, whether they be native or British, go elsewhere, and it's because they're no longer welcome, even though they.
No. What I meant was, Aaron, that when Ireland got independence, quite a lot of former Royal Irish Constabulary guys joined the Hong Kong police.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and you see actually that happens. But yeah, you're quite right, and it's also I think some of them go off into the Imperial Indian Police Force as well.
Yep.
Now, during the Irish War of Independence, the IRA are attacking. Now, there is a common myth about the IRA in this period that they are not sectarian. They are. They are shooting Protestants, and they are going after ex-servicemen, whether they be Protestant or Catholic, because they are ex-servicemen. They are killing innocent people, and they are going after anybody who has any connection to the Crown in any way. And it is absolutely they are brutal. They are people like to separate the idea of the IRA during the War of Independence and the Provisional IRA, but their actions are quite similar. They are as brutal as each other now, killing innocent people. And the British government in 1920 March they establish two forces. You have the Black and Tans and you have the auxiliaries. The Black and Tans are a paramilitary force who are there to support the Royal Irish Constabulary because they are under attack. And then you have the auxiliaries, who are actually a branch of the RIC itself. The Black and Tans are a separate organisation, and I don't know which. You might be able to remember this. One of them recruited only officers. I can't remember if it's the auxiliaries or the Black and Tans, but one of them solely recruited officers. One of them was.
I'm not sure, Aaron, but I do know that the reason they were called the Black and Tans is because they had a mixture of police and military uniforms.
Yeah, and another myth at this point I should point out is that the Irish Republicans like to claim that the Black and Tan auxiliaries were all criminals from British jails. They weren't. They were. I think it's the Black and Tans were the officers. Was the officer-only unit, and they were all British Army officers who had served in the First World War, and they were recruited. And I think, in fact, you weren't allowed to join the Black and Tans or the auxiliaries if you had a criminal offence. And a lot of the Black and Tans, a lot of the auxiliaries were Irish themselves. They were locally recruited. So this is very much a war where locals are fighting for the continuation of British rule. It is not this idea of only sort of Irish people fighting against the evil British. This is very much an Irish civil war as much as it is a Irish War of Independence. However, Black and Tans do use quite hard tactics against the IRA, and this causes a bit of discontent in Britain and leads to sort of questions over why the way the war is being conducted. And at the same time, the British government under Lloyd George is getting very sort of wary of this war because of course the IRA have a big loud voice in the United States and the Americans are putting on pressure. And so in 1921, the truce comes in June, July, and they start their treaty negotiations start, and then this treaty ends in partition of Ireland with the 6 counties of what's now Northern Ireland, of Ulster becoming Northern Ireland, and Southern Ireland, the other 26 becoming the Irish Free State. Now, I should say at this point that during the treaty negotiations in the south, it was pretty peaceful. In what becomes Northern Ireland, it is absolutely brutal urban warfare. There are snipers firing in both areas, both Unionist and Republican areas. There are murders going on. It is some of the worst violence what will become Northern Ireland will see until the worst years of the Troubles. That's not very well known about the War of Irish Independence, but that era for Northern Ireland is absolutely horrific. And
yeah, I was just going to say, so I read somewhere that at the time that the War of Independence for Ireland was coming to an end, like the IRA won like a few months worth of ammunition at best. So had we prosecuted the war, let's say for another 6 months, the IRA would have run out of ammunition, they would have run out, and they would have, at the very least, they would have to size down their operations, if not
Yeah,
completely
absolutely.
thrown in the towel.
Yeah, absolutely. The IRA, as you say, were on the verge of defeat. And if Lloyd George had gone, as you say, Mitch, another 6 months, the British would have won militarily, which is the great lost opportunity. But however, they did. And so you get the brutal violence going on in Northern Ireland. The IRA and Sinn Féin are not particularly, don't care that this is going on. They just regard it as continuing. They just continue this they see this as normal stuff going on, whilst in the south and nothing. No, there's pretty no violence. There are British troops still in the south, but they're in barracks. Now, there is finally the treaty comes into force in late 1922. It gets ratified by the Dáil Éireann, which is the Irish Republican Parliament. And so there is a gradual withdrawal of British troops from Ireland from late 1922 through to 1923. Now, in this period after partition, there is one big mistake the British government makes, other than not continuing to fight on, which is to impose home rule on Northern Ireland, which is that Northern Ireland gets its own parliament. Now, a lot of the troubles that you have in Northern Ireland between 1922 and 1969 are caused by the fact that Northern Ireland is governed by this Parliament, and the fact that MPs at the Northern Irish MPs at Westminster cannot raise issues at Westminster because the House of Commons has a rule that this issue is the purview of the Irish Parliament, the Northern Irish Parliament. It needs to be raised there at Stormont, and so this builds up all sorts of trouble. That if Northern Ireland had merely just been integrated into the rest of the United Kingdom and the same sort of local government situation as England, Scotland, and Wales, I'm very certain that troubles would not have happened.
Devolution's always a mistake, Aaron.
Yeah.
In my opinion, and we should have learned from the Ulster Parliament that it's always a mistake. You don't do it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the Enoch Powell, I believe he said many moons ago during the Troubles, we should just get rid of Stormont. We should just the whole thing of it, because I forget where I read this, but like I was like because the quote goes by someone, I think it was a Spanish author, who said basically devoluted parliaments by their own existence are a refutation of national government. So in other words, Stormont, you have, for example, James Craig, who says this is a Protestant parliament for a Protestant country. I often hear that quote misrepresented by a lot of these classic paddies who say, oh, they say that Northern Ireland was a kind of like apartheid, and so, well, not really. That was just the existing ethos of Northern Ireland being.
People forget, Mitch, that when the British Army was first sent into Northern Ireland in 1967, I think it was, they were first sent there to protect Catholics. And little old Catholic ladies in Catholic areas of Belfast were making British soldiers tea. But this was before the Provisional IRA saw this as their brilliant chance to start sniping at soldiers and causing riots and what have you, so that they could turn the Catholic population against the army. But the army was originally sent there to protect the Catholics, believe it or not.
Yeah, in fact, when during that sort of early period, you used to see graffiti in Belfast that had IRA equals I ran away. They regarded the IRA with such contempt, the Catholic community in Northern Ireland. Actually, Mitch bringing up that quote from Sir James Craig, at this point I would like to sort of point out something that another sort of popular myth. There is this contrast made between the supposedly backward, reactionary, sectarian, unionist regime in Northern Ireland and the supposedly Republican, forward-thinking, egalitarian regime that existed in the Irish Free State, Irish Republic. this is utter nonsense, and you can see this by two funerals. In 1926, the first Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, Sir Dennis Henry, died. He was a Catholic and a Unionist, and when he died, his funeral was attended by both the legal and the political establishment of Northern Ireland. Everybody went to it. Craig, Carson, absolutely everybody. There was no question of nobody attending because he was Catholic, because he was a Unionist, and he was a senior legal figure, and he was therefore a man to be respected. And he was also, you should point out, friends with many of the political and legal establishment of Northern Ireland. So they were going there to remember a friend. Now, fast forward to 1949. Douglas Hurd. Douglas.
Before you do that, Aaron, can I just mention one thing which I think is quite interesting? That in World War II, of course, Ireland was famously neutral, and in fact, the Irish government was probably a little bit pro-Nazi in some respects, and so what? You know, I think World War II was largely a disaster for Britain, but anyway. But it's interesting that about a third of the Irish Defence Force, the serving members of the Irish Defence Force, deserted, went north, and joined the British forces. And of course, many of their fathers and grandfathers had fought with the British. So, you know, but about something like a third of them did that, and then after the war, it took them decades before Southern Ireland gave them their pension rights back again.
Yeah, it wasn't until the 1990s that the Irish government apologised for doing that. And at the same time, the Irish allowed the Irish Free State Irish Republic allowed a lot of ex-Nazis to reside in the south, usually with strong government protections.
Yeah, and there were it was a place known for German spies and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, actually, this what I'm about to say is it actually connects to that, because when Douglas Hurd dies in 1949, he's involved in the Gaelic cultural revival in the 1880s-1890s before the First World War. He is a sort of cultural nationalist. He's importantly a member of the Church of Ireland, so he's an Anglican. And he is not involved in the War of Independence, but in the 20s he gets elected as a senator. And then the way the Irish, the Free State was set up, it is technically a dominion of the British Empire, but there is a push by Dave Valera, who's Prime Minister from 1932 onwards, for a republic, which eventually takes place in 1949. But using the abdication crisis of Edward VIII as an opportunity, they changed the role of Governor General into that of a president, and Hyde is made the first president. Now, when he resigns due to ill health in 46 and then dies in 49. Now, he has a state funeral, being former president. However, Duke, do you want to guess how many members of both the serving Irish government and the serving opposition attended his funeral?
No, mate, tell me.
One of each.
Jeez.
One government minister, who was called Noel Brown, who was a Protestant, and the other one from the opposition party, Erskine H. Childers, son of Erskine Childers, the author of Rivers and Sand from Fianna Fáil. He attends, and he's a Protestant, and he eventually goes on to become the president of Ireland in the 70s. The sheer sectarianism of the South is just it's almost suppressed in popular memory, but it was a remarkably sectarian state in a way that Northern Ireland really wasn't. I mean, people talk about Northern Ireland about Catholic and Protestant schools. That wasn't true. There were Catholic schools where Catholics overwhelmingly went, but there were state schools where everybody else went. It's just unbelievable.
Duke Valentino is trying to say this is completely false. Duke Valentino, I don't know you, mate, but I do know that this is one of Aaron's pet subjects, and I think he does know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Oh, sorry, no. This is the Erskine Childers. That the one who took. He was executed. This is the father of the man I'm talking about, Duke Valentino.
Yes, I realise.
Erskine H. Childers. Yes, that's quite true. He was in possession of a pistol, and in fact, that pistol was given to him by Michael Collins And when the Free State forces found it on him, they used it as a reason to have him executed. So that
I
was.
know there was another chap, Aaron, who was one of the 1916 guys who was executed, who during the Anglo-Boer War had actually been a British agent working against the Boers.
Oh, I think that actually might have been Childers.
Oh, was it him? It might have been, because I know there was one guy who was.
Yeah, because he didn't become an Irish nationalist until about 90. He was converted to it in about 1905, 1906. So just for those who don't know, Erskine Childers was Anglo-Irish Protestant ascendancy. He served in South Africa, as you mentioned. He wrote a very famous spy story called Riddle and Sands, which, if any,
Riddle and Sands, they've been made into films. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I recommend anybody to read the book and also watch the films, especially the one in the 70s, which is really good.
It's about the Germans planning an invasion of Britain in the First World War, or just before the First World War.
Yeah, and they're coming across from the plan is the Germans are planning to come across the North Sea from the Frisian coast to land on the east coast of England, where at the time which the book was published in about 1903, the Royal Navy didn't have a particularly large presence at that point. They would have obviously afterwards, particularly following the Anglo-German naval race.
Mm.
Yeah,
which we talked about on last week's history stream, guys, if you're interested. But you carry on, Aaron. Sorry, Mitch. I beg your pardon. You say what you were going to say.
I was just saying one thing. I don't know how well known this is, but I read somewhere also during the Second World War, Churchill was willing to give over Ulster to Eamon de Valera in exchange for Ireland joining the Second World War. And
that's another typical Churchill move that would have caused the Civil War, but okay.
Just to respond to the chap in the question, the children reforms, they were from by different children reforms.
Different children.
Not the same chap. They may, I think he was also possibly Protestant tendency. They may have been related, but they were a different chap. He was a Liberal politician under Gladstone who did that in 1881, I believe.
Yeah, it was 1881. It was when the British Army lost its numbers and became names.
Yeah. Now,
because they linked the first 25 battalions already had the first 25 infantry regiments already had 2 battalions. But as a result of the Childers reforms, all of the regiments were linked, so they had at least 2 battalions, which is why they lost their numbers.
Yeah. Now, just to discuss Northern Ireland at this point, during the sort of periods of from 1922 to 1969, whilst there was sectarianism against Catholics in Northern Ireland, it was a lot more complicated than the Protestant and Unionist bigotry. The Catholic community and the nationalist community refused from the very beginning to engage with the Northern Irish state. So, for example, they refused to take up seats in the Stormont Parliament. And also Catholics were advised not to work for Protestants or Unionists. They were to work for Catholic or nationalist groups. And so one of the reasons why you had high unemployment in this period is because there weren't enough Catholic nationalist employers doing around. Now, you did have one of the areas where there was discrimination against Catholics was in housing, in local government. However, it should be pointed out, in areas where you had Catholic nationalist majorities who controlled the councils, they discriminated against Protestants and Unionists in housing. It was very much a matter of who controls the council, decides who gets housing. And now, the voting rights in Northern Ireland, the thing that really comes to the fore in the late 60s that leads to the Battle of the Bogside and the British troops being sent in, is to do with voting in local government. For parliamentary elections, there was no discrimination at all. If you were, regardless of what your religious faith or political beliefs were, if you were if you're in Northern Ireland and you were of age, so 21, you could register to vote and you can vote. The issue was local government. They had what was called a ratepayer franchise. Now, this ratepayer franchise had existed on the British mainland up until 46 when the Attlee government scrapped it, and under this, you were if you paid the rate, you could vote for the local government. If you didn't, you couldn't. Now, if you look at the population sizes, more working class unionists and Protestants weren't able to vote in local government than nationalist Catholics were. Even if you take account for the different population sizes, they were still overwhelming majority. More of them voted in local government than the unionist Protestants did, and this is because they had actually had a developed, even starting in the 1920s, a developed middle class, which came about because of the Irish Parliamentary Party, which actually continued in Northern Ireland as the Nationalist Party until the early 70s. And I know that Davey 162 says he was told that Catholics were excluded from sitting in Parliament. That was true in Britain and in the old Irish Parliament before 1828. After that, Catholics could sit in there with the Northern Irish Parliament. That was like the British Parliament. So if you were a Catholic, you could take the oath. So Irish
that was the Duke of Wellington, Aaron.
Yes,
it was his move. The emancipation of Roman Catholics in Britain and in Ireland, which also made it legal, although there'd long been Catholic British Army and Royal Navy officers, but they had to keep it quiet. Whereas after 1828, it was perfectly legal to be a Catholic and a British Army or Navy officer, and many of them were.
Yeah, and now within Northern Ireland, you also had an issue with what you would call social standing mattered. So an institutional standing. So for example, the Northern Irish Civil Service, if you were a graduate, a unionist Protestant graduate of Queen's University, and you went for a job interview, and the other person going for the job was say a Southern Catholic who went to Trinity University Dublin from a nationalist background, the Trinity man will get it because the Northern Irish Civil Service was run by a conspiracy of Trinity men. Yeah, it gets even better. If you were a doctor in Northern Ireland, you would get your progress within the sort of the doctor's hierarchy in Northern Ireland depended on which rugby clubs you were a member of, not your religion. These things really did affect the way you did it. Just to answer Duke Valentino, yeah, there was discrimination, absolutely, but it did affect Catholics, though not to the degree people like to that Irish Republicans like to claim, and also it was not really as institutional as people claim. For example, the RUC from its beginning had a percentage, it had an institutional requirement of a certain percentage of Catholic officers. It never reached that because of the sort of this non-engagement attitude of the Catholic community. However, during the 1960s and 70s, there were various sorts of interviews done with retired and senior serving Catholic officers in the RUC, and they were asked about their careers, and they said whilst there were individuals who were anti-Catholic, they had never received any discrimination from the institution on the grounds of their religion. That they'd never had any things, that the religion never stopped them from being promoted. And so the RUC, so this idea of the RUC being this institutional Protestant organisation is not true. It was an organisation with a majority of Protestants, but it wasn't one that banned Catholics, and as it's quite right, the gentleman's quite right. Unionists, you had Protestants in the Shankill Road who were as poverty-stricken as Catholics were in other parts of Belfast. And at this point, we should point out about during the Troubles that more Catholics were killed by various Irish Republican paramilitaries than the IRA killed either RUC or British Army servicemen.
Well, I know for a fact, Aaron, because I saw it, that they planted bombs in shopping centres and gave people far too short a warning to evacuate.
Yeah.
And there were just as likely to be Catholics in those shopping centres as Protestants. They didn't give a shit.
In fact, the worst example I can think of the IRA doing something to a Catholic in Northern Ireland was, I've got his name now, Duke. When I tell you the event, you'll probably remember it. It was a Catholic. He was a Catholic man. He was living in Londonderry, born and bred. He ran a catering company, and he was supplying stuff for the British Army. He was having dinner with his wife and his 2 children. 2 provos broke into his home and dragged him out. And they got him into a van and padlocked him into a van, which they filled with explosives. And they forced him to drive it to a British Army roadblock and forced him to drive into it.
It doesn't surprise me.
Yeah,
and Fionn McCummel in the chat is talking about Robert Nearac, who was was a guards officer who was captured by the provos in plain clothes and supposedly fed into a mincemeat or something. Yeah.
Yeah, that he was, as he says, he was a Roman Catholic, and this chap I was talking about, this was about 91, when he was chained to the steering wheel, but the provost stupidly, from their point of view, had left the window down. So as he was approaching the roadblock, this bloke, knowing he was going to die, was shouting at the top of his voice to the soldiers to get away. And by doing that, he saved the lives of pretty much, I think, all but one of the British soldiers at that roadblock. He died, but they lived.
Fionn McCummel in the chat is pointing out that they killed loads of quite young soldiers. They did. I mean, when I went there, which was 1983, was my first tour in Northern Ireland, I did 2. And that was in Belfast. And we weren't allowed out of barracks at all when we were off duty. And the reason we weren't allowed out of barracks is the Provisional IRA would get a couple of cute chicks to start chatting soldiers up in bars, and then of course they'd be waylaid when they came out of the bar, taken away and executed. And the Provisional IRA did that sort of thing on quite a regular basis. So when I went there, you just weren't allowed out of barracks. The only good thing about it was you saved some money because there was fuck all to spend it on, if you'll pardon my French. But yeah.
Yeah, the treatment of the Catholic community in Northern Ireland by the IRA was worse than anything that they accused the Unionists of doing during the Stormont era. It was absolutely beyond contempt. And it's part of the reason why now, if you look at polling data of Catholics in Northern Ireland, there's a majority of Catholics who are now in favour of Northern Ireland or Unionist, because of they remember what happened to them or their parents or their, in some cases, grandparents during the Troubles. And if you were, the idea of a united Ireland is now further, at least among the population of Northern Ireland, more distant than it has ever been as a political prospect. And in large part, that's down to the treatment of the Catholic community in Northern Ireland by the Provisional IRA and the INLA and the other Republican paramilitaries.
Yeah, for sure. I don't disagree with anything you're saying, Aaron. I look, one time we found a woman's foot still in a high heel shoe, but just her foot, and I have no idea if it was a Catholic woman's foot or a Protestant woman's foot, but it was a woman's foot in a fucking high heel shoe.
Yeah.
Yeah, Just gonna say, yeah. There's an Instagram page called Propagandopolis, which if you search every time they post every time a page posts something about the Troubles or did anything about the IRA, you'll just see loads of tankies and plastic paddies just go in there and go, oh, up the bar, or they'll say stuff like the Protestants deserved everything we had, or they'll basically say like, the Unionists deserve everything we get, and even when you were to tell them, okay, you do know the IRA would kneecap fathers in front of their children and do sick crap all the damn time.
They murder fathers in front of their children, mate, not just kneecap them.
I read one account where it was something along the lines of, like they did some, I can't remember, but basically they tortured the guy in front of his children, like they just inside his own house and stuff like that. Where I know the other thing was, Lady of Shot said, where you'd have Protestant farmers living by the border, they would be killed off, and what the provost will do is they practically bully said farmers from inheriting the land. So it's basically just demographically replacing said Protestant farmers for sake of, like, let's say, Irish Republican ones, or he's just like wiping out a Protestant presence in a given local area.
And also the other thing, Mitch, is that quite a lot of the farmers in the border area and what have you were members of the Ulster Volunteer Force. Sorry, the what did they call the part-time Ulster soldiers?
The Ulster Defence Regiment.
Ulster Defence Regiment. That's it. A lot of those border farmers were part-time Ulster Defence Regiment guys, and that would be the excuse for the Provisional IRA to murder them, including sometimes in front of their children. And sometimes including their wives and children if it was a bomb or what have you. It was not pleasant. And of course, the eventual peace process. And I mean, look, I'm happy that there's not much violence in Northern Ireland anymore. But the peace process was it was a fuck up from the British point of view, because we basically very largely gave the IRA a free let-off. Loads of their guys who were in prison got let out, and until very recently they were still charging elderly British ex-soldiers for things they supposedly did wrong in Northern Ireland.
The other thing was, like with Lloyd George, had, let's say for argument's sake, Tony Blair for whatever reason decided to start to keep on prosecuting the Troubles, the Irish would have run out of money and weapons by the latest.
And also, Mitch, they were thoroughly, by the time of the so-called peace process, the Provisional IRA was thoroughly penetrated by British intelligence. I mean, I think probably 20% of the Provisional IRA were probably in the pay of British intelligence by then.
Yeah. And actually, bringing it up, Duke, I'll just Duke Valentino brought up agent. One of those was obviously Agent Steak Knife. Freddie Spitacci, I think his name was. He was a big mole inside the IRA. He was providing them with huge numbers of information. He was on the payroll. He was an agent of 14th Intelligence Company. I think that's the one. Now,
I think those things are good, Duke Valentino. He's asking me what I think about infiltration of the Provisional IRA. I think entirely good, mate.
Yeah.
I have no time for those people whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the Lord's paramilitaries, they were absolutely, as you say, Completely contemptible. They were criminal gangs. I mean, Enoch Powell used to make the point: the difference between the Provisional IRA and the UBF was the Provisional IRA were terrorists, whereas the UBF were fundamentally criminals.
Yeah, but I mean, let's not forget that there was plenty of gangsterism and criminality, and I mean criminality, not terrorism. There was plenty of that on the Provisional IRA side as well. So
they were the ones.
They were certainly they ran lots of taxi mafias, and they did lots of protection money, and it wasn't just the loyalists who did that. The provisional IRA did it too in different parts of the
yeah. I don't know. I was just saying that that's how they were perceived. If you know what I mean, I'm not saying the IRA weren't involved in criminality. They were, in fact. I think the IRA were to a degree involved in helping bring about the drug trade in Dublin as well as in Northern Ireland, and they
for sure.
I forgot the name of the bloke now. He was a gangster in Dublin who had a real go with the IRA during the 90s. What's his name? There was a film made about it.
Davey in the chat is saying if the British government was in charge of Ireland and there was trouble there now, they wouldn't even bother. I tell you what, the British Army today is not even big enough because at one stage, Britain had 30-odd thousand soldiers in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
That's half the British Army today. You know?
Yeah. And just yes, to thank you to the Duke Band. Martin Cahill, the General. There's a very funny film about him with Brendan Gleeson playing him. He got on the wrong side of the IRA because of that. He also at one point worked with the Loyalist paramilitary as well, which is a strange thing. But I suppose if you got on the wrong side of the IRA, working with the Loyalists makes sense. So the enemy of your enemy. Largely, the as Mitch has said, the IRA were on the back foot by the 90s, and the big thing that does that is the Enniskillen bombing in '87, which is where the provisional IRA bomb a Remembrance Day service in Enniskillen, and it's absolutely completely disgusting. I mean, not to say that the typical provisional IRA bombings weren't, but this is there were huge numbers of civilian people there, the ex-soldiers, their families. The old IRA canard of something being a military target. That was not a military target by any stretch of the imagination, no matter how much they claimed it. And that's one of the things that does is it starts undermining the financial support you get that the provisional IRA are getting from America through NORAID.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I don't know how true it is, but I've heard that there was some Protestant Irish people in North America who were giving NORAID money because they didn't know any better. They didn't know any better. You know?
No. I don't know about it, but I do know that outside of Scotland, the biggest funder for the Loyalist paramilitaries was in Canada.
There's
a strong sort of Northern Irish connection there. Obviously, that goes back to Bon Law.
I know Arthur Guinness, who was like a big funder of the Loyalists back in the time of Edward Carson, if I remember correctly, which is quite a bit funny when you see the plastic paddies like say, "Oh, I'm having a Guinness to mark my Irish identity," and it's like,
yeah. Yes. People forget this and that. People don't seem to know now that the Guinness family, still to this day, are strong unionists. After Guinness, they were particularly. In fact, the Guinness family, the sort of political activities begin when because of their loyalism during the United Irishmen revolt in 1789.
If anyone is interested, by the way, we spoke much earlier on, about the Fenian raids into Canada from America. If anyone's interested in that, there's an excellent channel on YouTube called British Muzzle Loaders, run by Rob, who's an excellent Canadian of Scottish heritage. And he's got quite a few videos about that stuff from a military point of view, which are quite interesting. So if you're interested in the Fenian raids on Canada, go and check that out. We've been going nearly 2 hours, gents, so maybe we can start to wrap this up.
Okay, I would say that the issue with Northern Ireland, the main running issue with Northern Ireland has been fundamentally one of the fact the British government has, since the Asquith government, treated the Unionists in Northern Ireland at best with disinterest and at worst outright hostility. And if the British government treated the Unionists like proper members of the British nation instead of the red-headed stepchildren of the British nation. Life would be so much better in Northern Ireland. And at this point, given the Catholic support for the Union, it would make life so much better for everybody involved.
Yeah, no, I agree. And of course, let's not forget that when Brexit happened, and I'm a huge supporter of Brexit and voted for it, but one of the things I certainly didn't agree with was that the British government allowed the European Union to treat Northern Ireland differently to the rest of Britain, which was insane.
Yeah.
Why didn't the British government just turn around and say, no, I'm sorry, you're not doing that. I don't care if Southern Ireland's part of the European Union still. You sort it out.
Yeah, it's worth noting. I retweeted something on Twitter where it said, so from the 4th of June, you'd have to have a travel document if you were to take like a pet dog or a cat to Northern Ireland, because of course, under the Brexit deal that Boris did, Northern Ireland is still technically part of the EU.
I know, it's craziness.
Like, it's just one of the things where you look, because I mean, as I said earlier, like the thing is, so Ulster, you could say is the most British of the British, because of course that's just the way that's the Iron Law identities, where if you live on the border, you're a lot more reinforced in your identity compared to, let's say, people who live close to the centre. Kind of like, for example, you have, Emperor Trajan, who colonized Dacia, or what we call now today Romania. You could say that Romania, the people there speak a Latin language, i.e. Romanian, to this day, because that's just the Iron Law of identity. But if you live close to the border, you are the most identitarian of that particular group. So, same goes with Ulster. Like the people there are the most British unions, and you think like, it's a general sense of shame that there are a lot of people in our circles who they just want to be shot of it. Like they just see Northern Ireland as kind of like, oh well, this goes against a spirit of brotherhood with the Irish, and it's like, well, what I can sympathise with the Irish regarding mass migration, but that doesn't mean we should screw over some of our own in-group to appease the sentiments of people who don't like us anyway to begin with.
Agreed, Mitch. Yeah, look, I fully support modern Irish nationalists, real Irish nationalists who are against mass immigration into Ireland. I fully support those people, and good luck to them. And I've had some of those guys on my stream in the past. But that doesn't mean I'd be willing to surrender Northern Ireland, because I wouldn't.
Yeah, and I'm often seeing like arguments where it's like, oh well, we must give over Northern Ireland to the Irish Republic because, for example, we don't like being a minority in London, therefore we must feel for the Irish because
what's that got to do with anything?
Well, it's just the simple fact is, like, so we took over Ulster and we colonised with our people because that's just the Iron Law. Like, if you win,
400 or 500 years ago, Mitch. 400 or 500 years ago.
You could have them 50 years ago and I wouldn't give a damn. Well, the fact is, if you lose, you are subject to the condition of the victor. Like, no one cries, for example, about Vercingetorix losing to Caesar, or no one like, I don't think Zulus nowadays cry about losing to us back in 1879.
Yeah.
So, likewise, I find this is one that I can find pathetic. Like, when you get Britain had to surrender to that Irish impulse of, oh well, we must feel a sense of shame over what happened with Ulster because we did it to another white country. Whereas no, it's a matter of it's just us taking our own side. And this is why,
as I said, Mitch, at the start of this stream, the argument that those people are using is the same argument that lefties in Australia come out with when they say the settlement will fall. It's exactly the same argument.
Yeah, I've seen.
The Ulster Protestants have been there a hell of a lot longer than any Australians have been in Australia,
Yeah, I remember like 5 years ago, there was one woman on Twitter when at Australia Fair. she was of Irish stock, and she was just like thoroughly anti-English. She was just very anti-British. Like she just, she would often resort to leftist argument. And bearing in mind, she called herself like an ethno-nationalist, white nationalist, words about nomenclature. She was meant to be part of our movement, and yet, she was just like obsessively anti-British in regards to like Australia and so on.
Oh, look, there are certainly Irish descent people in Australia who are prominent in the Republican movement. In terms of like making Australia a republic, but it's not a big deal in Australia at the moment. I've got to tell you.
Yeah, because it's like one thing because that's one thing that's one thing that can be like interesting question of itself is that okay, see how for example most diasporas in America largely assimilated, but largely just like scrapped their ethnic struggles. Like for example, you have the German Americans. Now I see some German Americans, like a really small group, who will celebrate Deutsche Amerikaners fighting against Eternal Anglo or whatever, but a really small group. The Italian diaspora, a lot of them just became a mafia that terrorized Sicily for a long while after the Second World War. Then you get the Irish diaspora, who, for example, they get into the Democrat Party, and just become massively insufferable. Like, what's his name? Kennedy, who was ambassador for the Americans during the Second World War to us. JFK's old man.
Very, very anti-British. Yes, he was.
Yeah, that's one thing is that the Irish diaspora are quite, I don't know, they've got an uncanny ability to just be insufferable in ways that other diasporas just haven't been, especially in regards to America.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's more people who don't live in Ireland, which is curious, but it's true.
You got Joe Biden, for example. His surname Biden comes from Devon, so it's an Anglo-Saxon name.
I know. What's his name? Duke Valentino said, "Could we discuss the India situation?" By which I think he means the Great Poo War of 2025. My only comment on India, Pakistan is that I wish the British government would provide one-way plane tickets to every single Indian and Pakistani who wants to go home and fight. That's my only comment on it. So,
I take up the Kissinger's position. I wish both sides can lose. So,
yeah, I've got no comment on it, but I'm fully in favour of Pakistanis and Indians going home and playing. I really am. But Aaron, this has mainly been your stream. Did you have any comments you'd like to end with before I ask you if you'd like to plug your channel, etc.?
No, I've pretty much said everything I could think of saying, to be honest.
Well, I certainly learned some stuff I didn't know, so thank you, Aaron. Mitch, did you have anything you wanted to plug, sir?
No, not for me.
All right, Mitch, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Aaron, would you like to plug your channel for people who are watching?
Yes, my channel is Aaron James Hook on YouTube. I review books, but also sometimes films and TV. And I am going to put up a couple of reviews tomorrow of 2 books and an audiobook. And then I am planning this month to read a couple of the Aubrey Maturin books written by Patrick O'Brien, because me and Duke are at some point in June going to do a live thing on the Patrick O'Brien book, probably on my channel.
Yeah, I'll look forward to that, Aaron. But definitely one of my favourite authors. I'm just checking that if we don't have any super chats on Entropy. I don't think we do. If we did have any, they haven't come through, and I did just refresh it. So, all right. Thank you very much, Aaron, and to Mitch. We'll be back on Saturday for our normal Splendid Isolation Current Affairs and Politics stream. Do come and join us there then. It's the same time, but on Saturday evening UK time and very early morning Australian time. So, and we'll see you then. In the meantime, don't let the bastards grind you down, and I'm going to play us out with what I hope is an appropriate tune. See how long that takes to get on here. There we go. It should work.
In our army, we're the
Someone's saying the sound was muted. I hope it wasn't. If it was, I don't know why, because it wasn't muted at my end. All right, guys, that was from Patriotic Archive. He's got an excellent channel. He's a friend of the channel, so do go and check him out. And it was, of course, about the famous 88 Foot, the Connaught Rangers, who were Rudyard Kipling's Devil's Own in one of his stories. Thanks again to my guests, Aaron and Mitch. Aaron's channel details will be under the stream later on. So, yeah, all right, guys, we'll see you on Saturday. Go well.